The ordinary customer. The city was alive that evening, its skyline painted in deep gold and amber as the sun slipped away and neon lights flickered to life. Streets pulsed with luxury sedans, limousines, and sleek sports cars, their headlights gliding like streams of white fire through the heart of downtown. At the center of this glow stood Le Chateau d'Or, a fine dining palace with marble steps, crystal chandeliers visible even from the street, and a reputation for serving the most exclusive clientele. It was the sort of place where a single dinner could cost more than a week's rent in the city's priciest apartments, and where the maitre d' could recognize regular guests not just by their names, but by the fragrance of their cologne. Inside, the air hummed with low, cultured laughter, the gentle clink of crystal glasses, and the muted notes of a live pianist who played in the corner as though the grand piano were whispering secrets only the elite could understand. Waiters in perfectly pressed uniforms moved with calculated elegance between tables, balancing trays that gleamed with silver and porcelain, their smiles practiced but sincere. This was an ecosystem of refinement, and every member of the staff took pride in maintaining its aura of perfection. At the host's stand near the entrance stood Ethan Parker, a young man in his late 20s whose ambition often exceeded his experience. He had been working at Le Chateau d'Or for 2 years, and while his service skills were commendable, he carried a certain quiet arrogance. To him, the restaurant was more than just a workplace. It was a stage, and he considered himself one of its gatekeepers. He believed that guests needed to fit the scene, the right clothing, the right mannerisms, the right attitude. Anyone who didn't exude that aura, in his eyes, simply didn't belong. Ethan had spent the last 10 minutes welcoming a glamorous couple dressed in designer evening wear, escorting them to one of the prime tables in the center of the dining room. As he returned to the host's stand, he noticed the restaurant doors open and his posture subtly shifted. Through the grand glass doors stepped a towering figure, broad-shouldered, over 7 feet tall, with a calm, unhurried stride. He wore a plain navy hoodie, loose-fitting sweatpants, and well-worn sneakers that looked like they'd seen years of faithful use. His clothing bore no brand logos, no flashy patterns, just comfort and simplicity. Ethan's first thought was that this man had taken a wrong turn. The stranger's outfit clashed with the sparkling glamour of the restaurant, where even the casual diners wore silk, cashmere, or bespoke tailoring. The second thought, less generous, was that perhaps the man had wandered in out of curiosity, hoping to take a quick look before realizing he couldn't afford to stay. The tall man's expression was relaxed, almost serene. He glanced around the dining room with the ease of someone perfectly at home in any environment. His eyes, warm but keen, took in the chandeliers, the golden decor, the slow waltz of servers carrying champagne flutes. When his gaze settled on Ethan, there was no trace of hesitation, only a polite smile. "Good evening," the man said, his voice deep, resonant, and unhurried. "Do you have a table for one?" Ethan kept his professional smile in place, though his thoughts were already forming judgments. His eyes flicked briefly to the sneakers, then to the hoodie, and back to the man's face. "Good evening, sir," he replied in a tone that was polite on the surface, but carried a faint undercurrent of doubt. "Do you have a reservation with us tonight?" The tall man shook his head. "No reservation. I was hoping there might be a spot available." Ethan hesitated just long enough for the moment to stretch. The restaurant was almost fully booked, but a few tables were still free. Under normal circumstances, a walk-in guest who looked so out of place might be offered a polite apology and told the evening was full. But something in the man's calm demeanor made Ethan curious enough to let the game play out. "We may have something," Ethan said, his tone measured. "But I should let you know this is a fine dining establishment. The menu is, well, it's priced accordingly." The man didn't flinch, didn't frown, didn't even blink. Instead, his smile grew a fraction warmer. "I understand," he said simply. "I'd still like to dine here tonight." The matter-of-fact response unsettled Ethan in a small way. Most guests who weren't familiar with the restaurant reacted to the mention of priced accordingly with a nervous laugh or an awkward nod. This man, however, gave no such tells. Still, Ethan decided to proceed with his own quiet test. "Very well," he said, retrieving a single leather-bound menu from the host stand. "Follow me." As Ethan led the man through the restaurant, weaving between candlelit tables where conversations paused just long enough for diners to glance up, he deliberately avoided the prime seating areas. Instead of the softly lit tables near the pianist or the sweeping window views of the city skyline, Ethan steered him toward the far side of the dining room, close to the swinging doors of the kitchen. This section, while still elegant, lacked the charm and prestige of the main floor. The lighting was dimmer, the air carried faint traces of cooking aromas, and the clatter of dishes occasionally broke through the otherwise tranquil ambiance. When they arrived, Ethan gestured toward the table with a smooth motion, masking his subtle smirk. "This should be comfortable for you," he said, placing the menu deuces. One with a gentle thud that was just loud enough for nearby guests to notice. "Your server will be with you shortly." The man took his seat without complaint, resting one large hand on the table and picking up the menu with the other. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying an easy warmth that made it impossible to tell whether he recognized the slight. He began flipping through the pages, his eyes scanning the list of elaborate French and Mediterranean dishes with quiet interest. Ethan turned on his heel and walked away, feeling a small surge of satisfaction. In his mind, this guest wouldn't last long. Perhaps he'd glance at the prices, make an excuse, and leave. Or maybe he'd order something minimal and hurry out, embarrassed. Either way, Ethan thought, it would be a brief and forgettable interaction. What he didn't realize was that the other diners had noticed. At a nearby table, Mr. and Mrs. Daniels, an elderly couple who had been regular patrons for over a decade, exchanged a look. Mrs. Daniels tilted her head slightly, her brow furrowed. "That was rather odd," she murmured to her husband. "Why seat him there when there are perfectly fine tables open?" Mr. Daniels sipped his wine, his sharp blue eyes following the tall man. "Because Ethan thinks he's a gatekeeper," he replied quietly. "He's quick to judge. I've seen it before." Meanwhile, the man at the corner table didn't seem to mind the location. He sat back in his chair, studying the details of the menu, pausing now and then to glance around the room with quiet appreciation. His composure was complete, his body language unhurried. It was as though the gentle music, the muted conversation, and the golden light from the chandeliers were all part of a pleasant evening he had fully expected. Ethan, from the host's stand, kept an eye on him while greeting new arrivals. The more the man failed to show discomfort, the more Ethan felt an inexplicable tension building. Something about that calm confidence, especially in a setting designed to intimidate those unfamiliar with it, didn't sit right with him. By the time the man's server approached, the first ripple of curiosity had begun to spread among the guests. Who was this man who carried himself with such quiet authority, dressed so plainly in a place where appearances were everything? And why, despite the subtle slight in his seating, did he look as though he were exactly where he wanted to be? It was the kind of question that could turn an ordinary dinner service into the start of something unforgettable. The seat no one wants. From his corner table, the tall man sat with quiet composure, seemingly immune to the undercurrent of judgment that rippled through Le Chateau d'Or. The table where Ethan had placed him was the least desirable in the restaurant, positioned just a few steps away from the kitchen's swinging double doors. Every few minutes, the doors would open with a muted thump, releasing the brief clatter of pans or the faint hiss of a simmering sauce, only for the sounds to fade again as the doors swung shut. While still tastefully decorated, this table lacked the soft golden ambiance of the main dining room, where candlelight reflected off polished wine glasses and the pianist's melodies floated like silk through the air. Here, the light was dimmer, shadows from the overhead fixtures falling unevenly across the white tablecloth. The other guests noticed. People who had been in this restaurant enough times to know the seating arrangement understood exactly what this corner meant. It was where large parties overflowed during peak hours, or where walk-ins without reservations were placed when the staff didn't wish to give up a prime table. It wasn't bad, but it was certainly not the seat for someone meant to be honored. And yet, the man in the navy hoodie didn't seem remotely bothered. In fact, he looked perfectly at ease. He adjusted his chair slightly to face the room more comfortably, took a slow sip from the glass of water the server had just placed before him, and began scanning the menu with the relaxed focus of a man who had nowhere else to be. Ethan watched from the host stand, his attention divided between greeting new guests and keeping track of the tall man's reaction. A part of him had expected, perhaps even hoped, that the man would call him back over and request a different table, giving Ethan the satisfaction of politely refusing under the guise of full occupancy. Instead, the man seemed content, almost as though the seat had been chosen on purpose. This quiet confidence made Ethan uneasy in ways he couldn't quite name. In his experience, guests who dressed as casually as this man often avoided drawing attention to themselves. This one seemed entirely unconcerned with how he might be perceived. Across the room, Maria Torres, the head waitress, noticed as well. Maria had worked at Le Chateau d'Or for over a decade, and she understood both the unspoken rules of hospitality and the subtle games people sometimes played in fine dining. She knew Ethan's tendency to judge and his belief that the restaurant's image was something he needed to protect. But she also knew that dignity wasn't measured in designer suits or luxury watches. From the moment the tall man had entered, she had caught the way his presence seemed to command space, not by demanding it, but by owning it naturally. She couldn't help but feel there was more to him than met the eye. The tall man's server, a soft-spoken young woman named Claire, approached with a professional smile. "Good evening, sir. My name is Claire, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. Would you like to start with something to drink?" Her tone was warm, but she was aware of Ethan's watchful eyes. She didn't want to step on his authority, yet she felt compelled to treat the man as she would any other guest. "Thank you, Claire," the man said, returning her smile. "I'll start with still water, and then perhaps you can recommend a wine once I've decided on my entree." His voice was measured and pleasant, each word carrying a sense of ease that seemed to slow the pace of the room around him. Claire nodded, jotting it down before leaving to fetch the water. As she walked away, Ethan intercepted her near the service station. "Keep it simple," he murmured under his breath, his tone low but firm. "Don't spend too much time fussing over that table. He's probably not going to order much." Claire frowned faintly but didn't reply. She knew better than to argue in the middle of a shift. Meanwhile, the restaurant's regulars continued to observe. At their central table, Mr. and Mrs. Daniels sat quietly, sipping their wine and watching the small drama unfold. Mrs. Daniels leaned slightly toward her husband. "Do you think Ethan realizes how obvious he's being?" she whispered. "It's not exactly subtle." Mr. Daniels shook his head, his eyes never leaving the tall man's corner. "No, and that's the problem. He's making assumptions without knowing a thing about the man. I've been in business long enough to know you never underestimate someone who's perfectly comfortable being underestimated." Back at the corner table, the tall man closed the menu and set it down gently, resting his hands lightly on the white linen. The water had arrived, and he took a slow sip, eyes drifting toward the pianist, who was playing a mellow rendition of an old jazz standard. He tapped his fingers lightly in rhythm against the side of his glass, his posture loose yet composed. Every so often, a guest walking toward the restroom would pass by and glance his way, perhaps recognizing him, or perhaps just curious about the tall stranger dining alone. Ethan decided it was time for his next move. He walked over to the Sis, a corner table with a measured step, the leather-bound menu still in hand as though he were about to present some kind of challenge. Leaning slightly toward the man, he spoke just loud enough for nearby tables to overhear. "Are you aware, sir, that our menu features some of the most exclusive and premium-priced dishes in the city?" His smile was tight, his tone courteous in form, but edged with condescension. "Some guests like a little guidance when making their selections. Would you like me to point out the less extravagant options?" The man's eyes lifted to meet Ethan's, steady and unflinching. For a moment it was as if the noise of the restaurant dimmed. "I appreciate the offer," he said, his tone even and kind. "But I think I'll go with the chef's recommendation for tonight. What's the signature dish?" Caught slightly off guard, Ethan straightened. "That would be the filet mignon au rossini, sir, prepared with truffle butter and foie gras. It's our most expensive item." He emphasized the last phrase deliberately, waiting for the hesitation he was sure would come. But there was none. The man smiled faintly, as though he had just been told the weather forecast. "Then I'll have that," he said simply. "And whatever wine your sommelier thinks will pair best." For just a heartbeat, Ethan's expression faltered before he regained his composure. "Very well," he said, collecting the menu. "I'll have Claire bring that right out." As Ethan walked back toward the host stand, the nearby diners exchanged subtle glances. Some looked amused, others intrigued. Maria, watching from across the room, felt the corners of her mouth lift ever so slightly. There was a quiet strength in the man's refusal to be rattled, and it was beginning to unsettle the very person trying to provoke him. The pianist shifted into a livelier tune, the notes rising and falling like a conversation that no one else could quite follow. And in that moment, though most of the guests didn't yet know it, Le Chateau d'Or had just become the stage for a lesson in dignity and the danger of judging too quickly. The man in the corner wasn't just waiting for his meal, he was waiting for the right moment. Testing patience. The gentle hum of the restaurant carried on, but for certain guests, particularly those who had been keeping an eye on the man in the corner, the air felt heavier, as if something unseen was winding itself tighter with each passing minute. The pianist continued with a slow, delicate arrangement, the sound of the ivory keys flowing like soft rainfall over the murmur of conversation. Candle flames flickered faintly with the movement of servers gliding between tables, their trays a balancing act of crystal glasses and gleaming porcelain. And there, in that half-shadowed corner, the tall man sat quietly, his fingers loosely wrapped around the stem of his water glass, every movement deliberate, unhurried, almost meditative. Ethan, however, was far from relaxed. Standing at the host's station, his eyes drifted toward the man every few moments, like a hunter checking that his prey was still in sight. There was a frustration he couldn't name growing in his chest, not just because the man had dared to order the restaurant's most expensive dish without so much as blinking, but because he did it without the show of pride or discomfort Ethan was used to seeing from customers out of their element. This one didn't seem out of his element at all, and that to Ethan was almost irritating. When Claire returned from the kitchen with the wine list, Ethan intercepted her again, his voice low but laced with that same air of control. "No need to overwhelm him with the full wine list," he said. "Just bring a single pairing suggestion, something modest." Claire hesitated, her brow furrowing slightly. "The chef's pairing for the Rossini is a Chateau Margaux," she replied carefully. "It's one of our finest." Ethan cut her off with a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Exactly my point. Let's offer something a little less ambitious. We don't want him choking when he sees the bottle price." The words dripped with a smugness that made Claire's jaw tighten, but she turned away without arguing. She had worked here long enough to know that confrontation in the middle of service was rarely worth it. Still, she made a quiet decision of her own. She would treat the man in the corner with the respect due to any guest, regardless of Ethan's whispered instructions. Back at his table, the tall man, who had been observing more than speaking, noticed the subtle glances exchanged between Claire and Ethan. His eyes tracked the room with the same calm attention he had used to scan a basketball court years ago, reading people's movements, expressions, and unspoken intentions. He had no need to react outwardly. His patience was a kind of armor, and he wore it without effort. The first test of that patience came in the form of time. 20 minutes passed, then 25. The restaurant's rhythm moved on. Appetizers appeared at tables, champagne flutes were refilled, laughter rose and fell like waves. But at the corner table, no bread basket, no amuse-bouche, no wine had arrived. Only the water glass, now half empty. Guests seated near him began to notice, some glancing over more frequently, others murmuring quietly to their companions. Mrs. Daniels, from her vantage point in the center of the dining room, leaned toward her husband and spoke just above a whisper. "This is deliberate. He hasn't been served anything but water." Mr. Daniels nodded slowly, his eyes narrow, pink slightly. "It's not just bad service, it's a test. Ethan's trying to see how far he can push before the man reacts." And Ethan was indeed watching for that reaction. Every time the corner table stayed quiet, he added another minute to the delay. In his mind, the man would eventually grow restless, maybe even embarrassed, by being ignored and either demand attention or walk out. Ethan imagined himself offering a falsely apologetic smile and saying something about how busy the night had been, his pride intact. But the reaction never came. Instead, the tall man seemed entirely unbothered by the wait. At one point, he even leaned back slightly in his chair, resting one elbow on the table and turning his head toward the pianist, who had just shifted into a soulful blues piece. The man began tapping his index finger in perfect time with the rhythm, a faint smile touching his lips. When the song ended, he gave a slow, steady clap 2 or 3 seconds after the final note faded, just enough to be noticed without drawing undue attention. The pianist looked up, met his gaze, and gave a small nod of appreciation. That moment, brief as it was, carried a strange power. A few diners smiled quietly to themselves. Maria noticed too, and in that smile she saw something telling. This was not the smile of someone trying to endure humiliation. It was the smile of someone entirely in control of himself, someone playing a longer game. Finally, after more than 30 minutes had passed, Claire approached with a bottle of wine. Ethan's plan to downgrade the selection had been ignored. Claire carried a bottle of Chateau Margaux with the steady, reverent grip of someone holding something precious. She placed it on the table, presenting the label for the man's approval. "This pairs beautifully with the Rossini, sir," she said warmly. "Would you like me to pour a taste?" The man's eyes glimmered with faint amusement as he nodded. "Yes, please, thank you for recommending it." Claire's expression betrayed the smallest flicker of surprise. She hadn't recommended it aloud to him yet. He was perceptive, too perceptive perhaps, and his gratitude seemed genuine. Ethan from across the room caught sight of the bottle and felt his jaw tighten. He had been circumvented. Still, he decided the next move was his. As the wine was poured and the man took a measured sip, Ethan walked over, wearing the polished smile of a host making casual conversation. "Enjoying the wine?" he asked, his tone neutral but edged with a hint of condescension. The man set his glass down gently, meeting Ethan's eyes. "It's excellent," he said. "You have a fine sommelier here." Ethan's smile thinned. "Yes, we do. But I hope you're aware that a bottle like this is considerably more expensive than most of our selections." The man's reply was calm, almost conversational. "I'm aware." A pause and then, "And worth every penny, if it's as good as I think it is." Ethan had no answer to that, so he inclined his head in a show of politeness and stepped away. But something in that exchange unsettled him deeply. The man hadn't bristled, hadn't deflected, and certainly hadn't been intimidated. It was as if Ethan's barbed reminders about cost had bounced harmlessly off some invisible shield. And then, without anyone realizing it, a shift began in the room. The guests who had been half watching the situation now watched more openly. A quiet tension built like a string being pulled tighter and tighter. It wasn't hostility, not yet, but it was the unmistakable sense that something was building, and when it finally broke, the sound would be heard by everyone present. What no one knew, except perhaps the man in the corner, was that Ethan wasn't the only one running a test that night. The gentle pushback. The evening crowd had reached its peak. Every table in Le Chateau d'Or was filled, the low hum of conversation blending seamlessly with the gentle current of music from the piano. Crystal glassware caught the golden light of chandeliers, casting subtle sparkles onto white linen tablecloths. The aromas of seared filet, buttery sauces, and freshly baked bread drifted in delicate waves through the air, tempting even those who had already ordered. The restaurant was a portrait of refined indulgence. Yet in the far corner, a subtle tension continued to grow, visible only to those paying attention. The tall man sat exactly as he had for the last hour, his posture loose yet dignified, one elbow resting casually on the arm of his chair, the other hand steady on the stem of his wineglass. His calm presence seemed almost at odds with the deliberate neglect he had endured, a quiet refusal to be baited into irritation. His patience was not passive, it was deliberate, calculated. If Ethan believed he was still in control, it was only because the man in the corner allowed him to believe it. Ethan had spent most of the last 30 minutes flitting between tables in the main dining area, ensuring the wealthiest and most visibly glamorous guests received his personal attention. His interactions with them were warm, polished, and effusive. His interactions with the man in the corner were cold, calculated, and minimal. Ethan's belief in his own authority was anchored in the assumption that he could read a guest's worth the moment they stepped through the door. But assumptions, like fragile glass, tend to shatter in the most public way when they are wrong. Claire returned from the kitchen, carrying a tray with the tall man's entree, the filet mignon au rossini, glistening under a drizzle of truffle sauce, the foie gras seared to a perfect golden crust. The scent was rich and intoxicating, the kind of dish that could silence a table with its arrival. She set it down gently in front of him, and for a moment the tall man simply looked at it, not in awe but with the quiet appreciation of someone who understood the craft behind it. "Thank you, Claire," he said, meeting her eyes with genuine warmth. "It looks extraordinary." She smiled, a touch more warmly than professional protocol demanded. "Enjoy, sir. If you need anything at all, please let me know directly." Ethan, who had been watching from a few tables away, noticed the exchange and felt a twinge of irritation. He strode toward the corner, his polished shoes clicking against the polished hardwood, and stopped just behind Claire as she stepped aside. "Everything satisfactory here?" he asked, his voice carrying just enough volume for the surrounding diners to hear. The man looked up from his plate, his expression calm but unreadable. "So far, yes," he said, "though I did notice something curious." Ethan's brow arched slightly. "Oh? And what would that be?" The man's tone was polite, almost conversational. "For a place with such an exceptional reputation, service here seems selective." The statement wasn't sharp, but it wasn't soft either. It was a measured observation delivered without raising his voice, yet it carried through the space between them with clarity. A nearby couple, mid-sip of their wine, froze subtly as if not wanting to miss the moment. Ethan gave a thin smile, masking his surprise. "We take great pride in providing excellent service to all our guests." The man's lips curved into the faintest smile. "All your guests? That's good to know. I was beginning to think perhaps I'd been seated in a section reserved for those of us not dressed for the occasion." Several diners within earshot exchanged glances. The words weren't angry, but they had weight. It was the first time the man had acknowledged the obvious slight in his seating arrangement, and he had done it with such composure that it didn't come across as a complaint. It came across as a subtle challenge. Ethan felt the corners of his confidence bend under the pressure, though he maintained the appearance of control. "We always do our best to accommodate walk-ins, sir," he replied. The man nodded once. "I appreciate that." And with that, he cut into the filet with slow precision, as if the matter were already settled in his mind. Ethan lingered a moment longer, then stepped back, his eyes narrowing slightly as he returned to the main floor. He couldn't shake the feeling that the conversation had not gone the way he intended, that somehow the man in the corner had just seized the upper hand without raising his voice or breaking a smile. As the tall man ate, his movements were unhurried, his attention shifting naturally between his meal and the life of the restaurant around him. He noticed the way Mr. Daniels, seated across the room, seemed to watch him with a hint of respect. He caught Maria's subtle glance from the service station, the kind reserved for people who recognized a situation unfolding beneath the surface. And most of all, he noticed the way some guests now looked at him differently, not as an outsider in a hoodie, but as someone who carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who belonged anywhere he chose to be. Halfway through his entree, Claire returned with the wine bottle to offer a refill. "Would you like me to top you off?" she asked. "Please," he said. As she poured, the tall man added in a low, appreciative tone, "You've been very attentive, thank you for that." Claire smiled, sensing the sincerity in his voice. "It's my pleasure, not everyone appreciates the details here, but I can tell you do." The exchange was small, almost invisible to anyone not watching closely, but to Maria, who had been watching from behind the bar, it was another sign of something shifting. The man in the corner was no longer just enduring the situation, he was quietly winning people over. When dessert menus began to circulate through the dining room, Ethan didn't bring one to the corner table. He wanted to maintain control, to keep the man slightly on the outside of the experience, But before he could execute that subtle omission, Claire was already there, placing a dessert menu on the table with a smile. "If I might suggest," she said, "the Grand Marnier soufflé is exceptional tonight." The man looked at the menu briefly, then set it aside. "Bring me one to keep one," he said, "and make sure you have one for yourself as well. You've earned it." Claire blinked, surprised, then nodded with a quiet smile. "Thank you, sir." From across the room, Ethan saw the exchange and felt the control slipping further away. The man in the corner wasn't just resisting his quiet attempts to diminish him, he was turning the service staff into allies. That wasn't something Ethan could easily undo. By the time dessert arrived, the man's presence in the corner was no longer an unnoticed detail in the restaurant's atmosphere. It was a point of subtle curiosity. Guests who had initially dismissed him as underdressed now looked over with discreet interest. There was an unspoken sense that something about him didn't fit the assumptions made earlier. And for the first time that evening, Ethan began to feel a shadow of doubt creep into his certainty. What Ethan didn't know was that the man's gentle pushback wasn't just about standing his ground, it was the first step in setting the stage for what would happen next. And when the final move came, it would be the entire room stunned. Whispers in the dining room. By the time the Grand Marnier soufflé arrived at the corner table, Le Chateau d'Or had shifted in a way that only seasoned observers could sense. The restaurant was still the epitome of refinement, candles flickering softly, the pianist coaxing slow melodies from the ivory keys, waiters gliding effortlessly between tables with trays that seemed to float. But beneath the polished surface, something else was moving, something subtle yet undeniable. The air had taken on a quiet electricity, the kind that made people lean in a little closer to their companions, voices dropping as eyes darted discreetly toward the far corner. It started with the Daniels. The elderly couple had been coming here for more than a decade, and they understood the rhythm of the place the way a sailor understands the tide. They knew which tables were always given to the regulars, which wines the sommelier held back for discerning guests, and which moments in the evening were worth paying attention to. Tonight, they had noticed more than most. Mrs. Daniels, leaning slightly over her glass of wine, murmured to her husband without taking her eyes from the tall man across the room. "He's not just some walk-in, Henry. Look at the way he carries himself. That's not confidence you learn from having money. It's confidence you're born with." Henry Daniels nodded, swirling the deep red in his glass slowly, his gaze following the man in the hoodie as he broke a piece of the soufflé's airy crust. "I've seen CEOs with less composure under pressure. He's here for a reason. The question is, does Ethan have any idea?" Around them, other guests were having similar quiet exchanges. At a table near the grand piano, a woman in a silk gown leaned toward her dining partner, her eyes flicking toward the corner. "I swear I've seen him before. Isn't he famous? Maybe an athlete?" Her companion, a sharply dressed man with a cufflink habit of adjusting his sleeves before speaking, studied the tall figure and shook his head. "If he is, he's not here to be recognized. That's a man who's testing the room, not trying to impress it." Even the pianist between sets found himself glancing in the man's direction. There was something in the way the guest had applauded earlier, measured, deliberate, not just a polite gesture, but a signal that he had been listening closely. Musicians notice these things. They know the difference between background noise and genuine attention. At the service station near the kitchen, Maria Torres had also been watching the evening unfold, her years of experience telling her that something was brewing. She'd seen guests mistreated before, subtle slights, delayed service, the quiet ways some staff expressed their personal judgments. But rarely had she seen someone meet that treatment with such unwavering calm. And never had she seen it done with this kind of quiet control, as though every reaction or lack thereof was chosen with care. Claire, returning from delivering a dessert plate to another table, leaned toward Maria and whispered, "I don't know who he is, but I can tell you one thing. He's not here by accident." Maria nodded once, her eyes steady. "No, he's not. And Ethan's walking himself into something he's not prepared for." Meanwhile, Ethan remained convinced, at least outwardly, that he was still in command of the situation. In his mind, the man's composure was just a mask, a performance that would crack as the bill approached. He was already picturing the moment, the hesitation, the awkward reach for a card that might not clear, the polite scramble for an excuse to leave. Ethan believed in these moments. They were proof to him that he could read people, that he could protect the image of Le Chateau d'Or from those who didn't be long. But what Ethan failed to notice was that the very image he thought he was protecting was already shifting and not in his favor. The guests, who once might have sided with the well-dressed staff member over the underdressed customer, were beginning to see things differently. The more Ethan ignored the man, the more others noticed. The more the man remained calm and courteous, the more his presence drew respect instead of judgment. The whispers grew, traveling from table to table like a slow-moving current. He hasn't complained once. Did you see how politely he spoke, even after that? He tipped the server before dessert. These small observations added weight to an emerging truth. In a room designed to showcase wealth and refinement, true elegance was being displayed not in the center tables under the chandeliers, but in the dim corner by the kitchen doors. The soufflé was nearly gone when Claire returned to check in. "How was it, sir?" she asked, her tone both professional and warm. "Perfect," the man said, setting his fork down gently. "Light, balanced, exactly what I hoped it would be." He looked at her for a moment, as though considering his next words carefully, then added, "You've made the evening better, Claire. Thank you." She blinked at the sincerity of it. Guests often thank their servers, but rarely like this, with an acknowledgement that felt genuine, personal, and without pretense. From the main floor, Ethan saw the exchange and felt a faint but growing unease. He had noticed earlier that Claire seemed more at ease with the man than with most guests. Now it was obvious that a rapport had formed, one Ethan hadn't sanctioned. He didn't like it. Worse, he couldn't quite explain to himself why it bothered him so much. The dining room's conversations continued, but here and there, eyes drifted to the corner more openly now. The man's presence had become a quiet focal point, and not because he was out of place, but because he seemed to be exactly where he wanted to be despite appearances. He was unshaken, unbothered, and entirely in command of himself. Mr. Daniels summed it up best as he leaned toward his wife. "That man isn't just eating dinner. He's telling a story, and none of us know the ending yet. But I have a feeling when it comes, it's going to change the way this whole room sees itself." And for Ethan, who still believed the night would end on his terms, the first cracks in his control had already begun to show. He just didn't know it yet. The reveal. The night had worn on, and Le Chateau d'Or was deep in its golden hour glow. The crowd had settled into the comfort of their courses, the piano drifting through softer, more intimate melodies. Candles burned low with tiny, steady flames. Yet beneath the elegance, an almost tangible anticipation hovered in the air. The guests might not have been able to name it, but they could feel it. That strange quiet before something changes, before an evening becomes a story worth telling. In the far corner, the tall man in the navy hoodie finished the last sip of his wine, setting the glass down with the same deliberate care he had shown all evening. There was nothing hurried in his movements. Everything he did seemed to unfold on his terms. Around him, a few of the nearest tables had grown quieter, conversations punctuated by stolen glances in his direction. They had been watching, not openly enough to be rude, but with the discreet curiosity of people who sensed they were in the presence of someone important, even if they couldn't yet explain why. Ethan, still holding fast to his private belief that the man's calm was an act, decided it was time to close out the evening. He pictured the moment with a certain satisfaction, walking the bill over himself, placing it down with quiet finality, and watching the first flicker of discomfort on the man's face. Perhaps there would be a pause, perhaps a request to split the payment between two cards, perhaps even a forced laugh to mask surprise at the total. Ethan had seen it before, and he believed he was about to see it again. He picked up a leather check presenter from the service station, tucking the printed bill inside without even glancing at it, and made his way toward the corner. But before he could reach the table, the tall man lifted his hand, not toward Ethan, but toward the bar at the far end of the room. Jamal Rivers, the restaurant's general manager, stood there reviewing a delivery schedule on his tablet. A former maitre d' with an impeccable reputation for discretion, Jamal was not the sort of man a guest casually summoned. The chain of service here was deliberate, and the manager was typically a last resort for addressing a complaint. But when Jamal saw the gesture from the corner table, his reaction was immediate and unexpected. He didn't just walk. He moved quickly, almost briskly, his expression transforming from neutral professionalism into something more alert, almost deferential. Guests who had been idly watching suddenly leaned in closer. Mr. Daniels set his wine glass down with deliberate slowness, murmuring to his wife, "Watch this. Something's about to happen." When Jamal reached the table, he didn't greet the guest with the standard, polite nod. He extended his hand with genuine warmth and a broad smile. "Good evening, sir," he said in a tone that carried just enough volume to reach the nearest few tables. "I didn't know you'd be joining us, Tun. My apologies for not welcoming you the moment you arrived." Ethan froze a few steps away, the check presenter still in his hand. The words didn't match the scene he had imagined. In fact, they didn't match the tone anyone used with a walk-in diner, especially not one who'd been seated near the kitchen. The tall man stood, shaking Jamal's hand firmly. "No need for apologies," he replied, his voice steady but now edged with something new, not the casual politeness of earlier, but the weight of a man accustomed to being listened to. "I wanted to see the place the way everyone else does. No special treatment." Around them, the whispers began instantly, though in this refined setting they were still hushed, restrained. "He knows the manager?" That wasn't just a polite hello. "Did you see Jamal's face?" Jamal's smile remained, but there was a seriousness in his eyes as he glanced around the dining room, taking in the atmosphere. "If I may, sir, we'd be honored to move you to a more comfortable table." The man shook his head, the faintest glimmer of amusement touching his features. "No need, I've had a good seat. I've been able to see everything from here." Those words landed differently for those listening closely. They weren't simply about the view. There was an undertone, a quiet suggestion that seeing everything meant more than observing the decor and the pianist. Ethan felt a prickle of unease at the back of his neck. Jamal inclined his head. "Of course. Would you like me to arrange a tour of the kitchen before you leave?" Ethan's unease deepened. A tour of the kitchen was something offered only to the restaurant's closest friends, investors, or very high-profile guests, people who had a stake in Le Chateau d'Or's reputation. The tall man's answer was calm but telling. "Yes, but first, let's take care of the bill. I want to make sure everyone here tonight can, as I paid for my meal, personally." And then, without fanfare, the man turned to Jamal. "Shall we?" Jamal gestured toward the kitchen doors, and as they walked together through the dining room, the quiet murmur of voices followed them. By the time they disappeared into the kitchen, Ethan stood rooted to the spot, the weight of something unspoken pressing down on him. He didn't yet know the full truth, but one fact was becoming inescapable. He had badly underestimated the man in the corner. And when the truth came out, it wouldn't just rewrite the story of the evening, it would rewrite Ethan's place in it. The lesson. The moment the kitchen doors closed behind them, the warm glow of the dining room gave way to the precise hum of a professional operation. Stainless steel counters gleamed under bright overhead lights, the air alive with the sounds of sizzling pans, quick footsteps, and the muted clatter of plates being prepared for service. The aromas here were more intense, rich reductions, seared meats, fresh herbs releasing their fragrance under the pressure of a chef's knife. Every member of the kitchen brigade moved with a rhythm that was almost choreographed, a balance of urgency and control. As Jamal led the tall man through the narrow walkways, the staff reacted in ways that caught even the nearby line cooks off guard. Heads turned, conversations paused for just a moment, and then, one by one, people nodded, smiled, or greeted him in a way that carried genuine warmth. It wasn't the surprise reserved for a celebrity sighting. It was the recognition of someone who belonged here, someone they respected. One of the sous chefs, wiping his hands on a pristine white towel, stepped forward with a wide grin. "Good to see you again, sir," he said, his voice low but tinged with pride. "It's been a while since you visited the kitchen." The man smiled back. "You've kept the place running beautifully. Dinner was outstanding." Jamal glanced at Ethan, who had reluctantly followed them into the kitchen at the manager's quiet instruction. The younger man looked slightly out of place here, his earlier confidence muted by the unfamiliar environment and the strange way everyone seemed to know their guest. When they reached the far end of the kitchen, the tall man stopped, turning so that he faced both Jamal and Ethan. His expression remained calm, but there was a new weight in his gaze, a stillness that made Ethan's chest tighten slightly. "I suppose," the man began, his deep voice steady, "it's time I stopped being just the man in the corner table." He looked directly at Ethan, not unkindly but without flinching. "My name is Shaquille O'Neal." The words landed like the soft drop of a stone into water, quiet but instantly rippling outward. Ethan felt the recognition hit him like a physical force. Of course he knew the name. Of course he recognized the face now that it had been said aloud. Shaq, the Hall of Fame athlete, the businessman, the philanthropist, the public figure who had built a reputation not just on talent, but on generosity. And now, standing in the kitchen of Le Chateau d'Or, he was more than a guest. He was the owner. "I bought this restaurant 5 years ago," Shaq continued, his voice still even. "I don't come in often. When I do, I don't announce it. I like to see how my guests are treated when nobody's watching." He let the words hang there for a moment, not sharp or accusing, but heavy with the truth they carried. Hospitality is about respect, and respect isn't something you give only to the people who look the part. Ethan's mouth felt dry. He wanted to speak, to explain, to defend himself, but the weight of the evening pressed against his throat. Every choice he had made, where he seated Shaq, how long he delayed his order, the condescending remarks about prices, all of it replayed in his mind, now illuminated by the reality of who had been on the receiving end. Shaq's gaze softened slightly, but his tone remained firm. "I've been in rooms where people decided who I was before I opened my mouth. Sometimes I proved them wrong, sometimes I didn't bother. Tonight I gave you the chance to show me who you are when you think no one important is watching." Jamal stood silently beside them, his expression unreadable but his posture tense. The rest of the kitchen had gone quiet, the air thick with the awareness that something important was happening. Ethan finally found his voice, though it was quieter than before. I misjudged you. I'm sorry." Shaq nodded once, accepting the words but not rushing to erase the weight of the moment. "I'm not here to embarrass you," he said. "I'm here to make sure you understand something that will matter long after tonight. In a place like this, every guest should feel like they belong. Whether they're wearing a tailored suit or a hoodie, whether they order the cheapest glass of wine or the most expensive bottle, your job is to treat them with the same respect." Ethan swallowed hard, the lesson settling deep in his chest. "You're right," he said quietly. "I'll do better." Shaq's smile returned, slow and genuine this time. "Good. Because when you treat people right, you're not just doing your job, you're building something worth coming back to." He looked at Jamal. "Let's make sure that's the standard here, every night. No exceptions." "Yes, sir," Jamal replied without hesitation. When they returned to the dining room, the air seemed to shift again. The whispers that had followed Shaq into the kitchen swelled into a quiet wave of realization as more guests recognized him. A few people smiled and nodded in acknowledgement, others simply watched, understanding now why the man in the corner had carried himself the way he did. Shaq didn't make a scene. He didn't stand in the center of the room or demand attention. He simply walked toward the exit, stopping only to thank Claire for her service and to offer a warm handshake to Mr. and Mrs. Daniels, who had watched the night's events with knowing eyes. As the doors closed behind him, the restaurant returned to its usual rhythm, but the night was no longer ordinary. For Ethan, it was a turning point. He would remember the lesson not as a moment of humiliation, but as a moment of clarity, the night he learned that the true measure of a person isn't found in their clothes, their bank account, or the table they sit at, but in the way they carry themselves and the way they treat others. And for everyone else who had been there, the story of the man in the corner became part of Le Chateau d'Or's quiet legacy, a reminder that in a room full of refinement, the greatest dignity often comes dressed in simplicity,